A very good evening and I welcome all the master faculties and guests for this live webinar on management of pulmonary fibrosis and cytokines production in COVID-19 patients. Innovation resonates a sense of purpose in the evolution and existence of human life. The creative capacity of human mind has always been the source of inspiration. We at MSN believe every life matters and everyone deserves quality medicine. Apart from efficacy, affordability, and accessibility, we want to be the first to touch and impact human lives, and we are MSN, Research for Better Medicines. The quest for innovation drives us to serve better and better today and tomorrow. And we have one of the Asia's largest integrated pharmaceuticals APA and formulation R&D center. And our turnover crossing 600 million USD and presence in 65 countries globally and 8 offices worldwide, including US and UK, and 11,000 workforce globally, and won the trust of more than 4 crore customers across 65 countries, an integrated state of R&D center and 14 manufacturing facilities in India and USA talks about our global presence and made us global Indian pharmaceutical company, making Tricolor proud and Research for Better Medicines. And this has helped us to have 250 plus products in pipeline, 600 plus patents globally, 715 world's largest DMFs in US, and 45 dossiers and 100 plus ANDAs submitted in US, and 25 products approval in US, and 20 plus products tentative approval in US, and 17 products commercialized in US. And these all helped us for MSN to launch first time in India molecules starting from 2013, Prasugrel, Febuxostat, Tapentadol, Tolvaptan in 2013, and in 2015, Bosantan, Dexlansoprazole, Roflumilast, Vilazodone, and in 2016, Lurasidone, and in 2017, Mirabegron, Sildosin, and in 2020, we have launched Triantine. And now in 2021 also we could launch Dapagliflozin, Sacubitril, Tofacitinib, and Rivaroxaban. So MSN expertise of research to innovate brought first time India launches to support super specialties and bringing down Indian patient sufferings. Who to be better stand by you, a company with global research, global manufacturing, and global quality, a company which has acquired trust globally. We at MSN on a journey to serve you better and better. So before we start the meeting, I would take this opportunity to partner in creating awareness in the management of pulmonary fibrosis and cytokine production in COVID-19 patients, and approach for emerging treatment options that to increase the patient's life expectancy and quality of life. So before we go into the meeting, I would take this opportunity to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Pratibha Gogi, Head of Department, Venkateshwara Hospital, New Delhi. Madam Dr. Pratibha Gogi completed DNB in Respiratory Medicine from Sri Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi, and Fellowship ERC from Royal Brompton and Chesla Westminster Hospital, Imperial College of London. And right now she's Head of Department, Venkateshwara Hospital, New Delhi. And she was a consultant at BLK Super Specialty Hospital, New Delhi. And she also worked as a consultant intervention pulmonology at Rajiv Gandhi Cancer Hospital and a consultant of respiratory medicine and critical care medicine, Jaipur Golden Hospital. And she's an expert in advanced bronchoscopic procedures like CB, EBUS and radial EBUS and foreign body removal, balloon bronchoplasty, tumor debulking, medical thoracoscopy, and she has done several poster presentations, article publication in national and international journals. With this, I request Madam Pratibha to take over the session.
Okay, good evening. And in the busy time when I am handling, am I audible?
Yeah. Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
The busy time when I'm handling more than 100 plus COVID positive critically ill patient, because my hospital is a totally COVID hospital having 250 COVID patients, and being a pulmonologist, the burden is high. Still, when MSN came with the proposal of this meeting, I could not resist to be a part of that. I'm working 12 hours a day, but the agenda of meeting is so relevant in the present scenario that despite of the busy schedule, I have to take out this hour to be a part of the meeting. The reason being that the meeting addresses the relevant clinical problems which we are facing. The new virus is damaging lungs beyond repair. The duration of lung involvement, which was shorter in the earlier strain of the virus, has prolonged for more than 14 days. Now we are seeing ground glass opacities even in the cities at 21 days. After that, pulmonary fibrosis is setting in. And at the same time, we have got few new molecules like baricitinib and tofacitinib on the front, which we are using. Though our knowledge and previous experience with these molecules are limited. They are basically the tools in the armamentarium of the rheumatologist. So in a way, we have created a very balanced faculty in this meeting involving 3 pulmonologists and 2 rheumatologists, and to tackle very 2 relevant problem of cytokine release storm and pulmonary fibrosis. So not taking much of the time, both of the topics are very relevant in critically ill COVID patient in the present era. I will not hold the speakers for long, and I would like to, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Gaurav Chhabra, who's a professor in Geetanjali Medical College. Can we have a slide CV, please? So we have Gaurav Chhabra. He has extensive, he's head and unit head and head of department in Geetanjali Medical College, Department of Pulmonology, actively involved with the care of COVID patients. His special interests are asthma and allergy, along with bronchoscopic procedures. And he would be talking about pulmonary fibrosis and what is the state of art, what is the evidence in favor of very limited options which we have in the form of steroids and antifibrotic agents. So I invite Dr. Chhabra for the first presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Pratibha, for kind introduction and inviting me for this relevant topic. Just a moment, I'm just sharing my screen. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today, my topic is very, very important with lots of patients with this long-lasting, life-threatening sequelae, that is pulmonary fibrosis. We all are dealing with this. This is this causing more disability and more challenge to deal this pulmonary fibrosis rather this COVID per se. Yeah, and as Dr. Pratibha said, we are really dealing with a massive pandemic due to this novel coronavirus, that is SARS-CoV-2, and which is causing lung fibrosis, which is very, very emerging complication and very threatening complication. And today, my aim is to just understand the that pathogenesis and the role of antifibrotic drugs along with other drugs to treat this sequelae. Sorry,
Technical issues, Dr. Chhabra. I think you will take 10 minutes to go through that. Shall I invite Pooja?
Yeah. Here is the electric shutdown. So please.
We understand. Things can go wrong. Please charge your this thing. Pooja, are you there?
Yeah.
Dr. Pooja. Dr. Chhabra, can you stop sharing your screen? I can invite Pooja.
Sure.
So, Dr. Pooja, I'm sorry for an for saving the emergent situation. So we have Dr. Pooja Srivastav, who's a practicing rheumatologist in Ahmedabad. And she has the most illustrious affiliations I could see, with MBBS from AIIMS, Delhi, with MD from PGI Chandigarh, and her DM clinical immunology from SGPGI Lucknow. It's a pleasure to have her here as our next speaker, and she'll be talking about the extended use of few of the molecules which are currently being used for years by our rheumatologist friends. So over to Pooja.
Thank you, Dr. Pratibha, for the warm introduction. I'll be speaking on with little detail on some of the immunomodulators, and rest, I think if there are questions, we'll take it, because covering all of them in 15-20 minutes time would be difficult. So
yeah, I understand.
So I think first thing we all know this over last 1 year, that in COVID-19, we have a pre-symptomatic phase, a virologic phase, and then the main problem starts after day 7, 8 of illness, when the cytokine storm starts. So like there is 3 to 5 days incubation period where viral initially replicates, and then we become infectious, and then we go on to develop symptoms. So generally for that knowing of timing is very important for planning any medicine in this disease. So first thing, whenever we are taking history, I think we should always write down where it is the day of illness. So in like once we start having symptoms, fever, malaise, cough, headache, those kind of symptoms, that we should count as day 1 of illness. And the first week, first 5 to 7 days is the period of viral replication. This time we would have leukopenia, lymphopenia, and inflammatory markers are not much elevated. Then we enter the second week. Second week is the early pulmonary phase, and then this early pulmonary phase, some people improve with this phase, and some go on to extensive cytokine dysregulation, followed by macrophage activation and ARDS and death. So if we see the cytokines over this last 1 year, from the autopsy series, from the various cytokine studies, we have understood that actually the death and morbidity in COVID is partly because of virus, but the long-term morbidity and the mortality is because of the host immune response. Who will deteriorate and who will improve is decided by the host factors more than the virus. So in the first viral replicative phase, that is first week of illness, we see that once there is high viral load, the top graph, high viral load, and the cytokine which we see in first week is more of type 1 interferon response. That these cytokine is the main antiviral effect. So at this point of time, antivirals, first week is the time for antivirals. So antivirals like Fabiflu, Remdesivir, or the interferon blockade. So that would work in first week. Then comes the second week where actual cytokine storm starts. So this second week, by second week, type 1 interferon response dampens, and we have more of adaptive immune kind of cytokine response, where we have high levels of IL-1, IL-6, IL-18, TNF-alpha, and a lot of pro-inflammatory cytokines. More than 50 cytokines have been reported. So second week onwards is the period where we should use immunomodulators, including steroid. We should avoid all the immunomodulators and steroid in first week of illness. And so what we are seeing in SARS-CoV disease is there is lymphopenia, which leads to increased risk of microbial infection. And by second week, there is again a lot of cytokine storm, which is causing dysfunction in our lungs, liver, kidneys, and it is also causing cell death, myocarditis. So we need to balance our immunomodulators. So the main question arises, should we stimulate or should we suppress the immune system in COVID-19? So I think it needs a very balanced approach and a very timely intervention. So in the first week, where we want to block viral entry and we don't want to suppress the innate immune response. So first week, use only antivirals if needed. Second week, where the relative lymphopenia starts improving and the cytokine storm sets in, this is the period, if the immunomodulators are introduced at right point of time, we can prevent complications in quite a few patients. So timely administration is the most important point. And so over this, in this whole pandemic season, we have hardly had any new drugs. Most of the drugs has been repurposed for treatment of COVID-19. And the maximum benefit and has been shown with steroids and it has become the standard of care. But all patients are not improving with steroids, and we are seeing a lot of complications with steroids, especially the new onset mucormycosis epidemic. So we have many other drugs like IL-6 blockade, JAK inhibitors, TNF blockers, anti-VEGF therapies, anti-CD6 therapies. I'll be speaking mainly on JAK inhibitors. I'll just touch upon IL-6 because we have maximum evidence for them. And the rest of the things have only anecdotal response. So if there are some questions on it, I'll take it up. So IL-6 blockade, there was a lot of controversy. We had a lot of positive papers and a lot of negative papers on it. So at present, I think we can conclude from the REMAP-CAP study, that is the latest study on tocilizumab. So how does this drug act? It reduces cytokine storm mainly by blocking IL-6. IL-6 is one of the main cytokine, and blockade of this also blocks multiple downstream cytokines. So apart from blocking of IL-6, what it does is it also reduces pulmonary hypertension by it inhibits indoleamine 1,3 deoxygenase. So this enzyme is important for tryptophan metabolism, and tryptophan is the actual fuel from which most of the cytokines are formed. So it not only reduces IL-6, it also decreases the production of multiple other cytokines. There have been negative and positive study, but the results which we see from this REMAP-CAP trial, this was the probably biggest trial where 800 patients were there, 400 in each arm, IL-6 blockade and 400 control. And these were very critically ill patients. In this trial, what they found that tocilizumab was effective in decreasing organ support or improving mortality only in those patients who were critically sick and were requiring some kind of organ support. That means they were requiring some kind of BiPAP or mechanical ventilation or antihypertensive blood pressure medicines. It didn't help in patients who were mild or who were beyond that. So the best time to use tocilizumab would be within 1 to 2 days of admission to ICU in those patients who have a very high cytokine markers and are just going to require some kind of organ support. So timing is the best guider here. So in critically ill patients, it did decrease organ support and improved survival. Now, the main drugs which we'll be speaking today is on JAK inhibitors. We have had 3 papers and a meta-analysis on it. What these molecules we have been using in rheumatoid arthritis for last 8 years. It was approved first in 2012, and very good results in arthritis, and relatively a safe drug if monitored properly. So what it does is it blocks the cytokine receptors on cell surface and decreases cytokine signaling, and thus blocks production of multiple cytokines. We have 2 molecules in India, baricitinib and tofacitinib. The main difference between these two is which JAK, like in this picture we can see there are different JAK1, JAK2, JAK3, TYK1. So baricitinib is more of JAK1 more than JAK2 blocker. Tofacitinib is little less selective. It is more of JAK1 inhibitor, then JAK3, then JAK2. So this has been repurposed for use in COVID because it can alone, instead of targeting one cytokine with tocilizumab, IL-6 with anakinra IL-1, this molecule can work as a broad cytokine inhibitor. So the first result on baricitinib we had from ACT-2 trial, where 1,033 patients received baricitinib versus placebo, and baricitinib plus remdesivir arm showed improved 1-day reduction in recovery time. They required less of oxygen, and they also had less of serious adverse event. So baricitinib plus remdesivir improved the recovery. And apart from this recovery, they also studied the cytokine part. So they demonstrated that baricitinib, apart from blocking the inflammatory cytokines, it also had some effects on potential viral entry into the cell by blocking the entry receptor, by decreasing the availability of ACE inhibitor and AP2 receptors. So there was another study, this was published in this month only, May, co-barrier study. Again, baricitinib, a much larger study. And this is more like what we use in current scenario. So phase 3 double-blind randomized control trial with 15-25 patients, 1:1 allocation. Baricitinib was given with 4 milligram once daily doses for 14 days or discharge, whichever was earlier. Primary endpoint was need for mechanical ventilation and secondary was 28-day mortality. So what we saw in this trial was mortality was 8.1% in baricitinib group and 13.1% in placebo group. The placebo here was remdesivir and dexamethasone, which is at present standard of care, and all our patients are receiving dexamethasone, remdesivir, and low molecular weight heparin or anticoagulations who are in inflammatory phase of disease. And with the statistical calculation, they said that one death was prevented for 20 patients treated with baricitinib. So in current pandemic situation, that's an important result. And baricitinib has been, like we have these studies for last 2 months. There's one more very interesting study. This was a very courageous study published in March where tofacitinib was used. Tofacitinib was compared with tofa alone and tofacitinib along with dexamethasone. So 269 patients were randomized. This was a study which was done at the onset of pandemic, so March 2020. The study duration is from March 2020 to September 2020. There, the group of researchers, they studied the autopsy series and they found there are a lot of lymphocyte infiltrates, and instead of blocking 1-1 cytokines, let us block something broader. At that time, even steroid was not the standard of care. So what they did, April, May, June, 3 months, all the patients who were in inflammatory phase admitted to their hospital, all of them were treated with 10 milligram twice daily tofacitinib for 10 to 14 days. And in July, the results of recovery trial were published, and the hospital ethics committee said that tofa is totally a new drug. You cannot use it. Now we have a standard of care. So start dexa and stop tofa. So the second arm came there, where in month of July and August, they use only tofacitinib, only dexamethasone, and stop tofacitinib totally. What they observed in these 2 months is that their mortality doubled. So in month of September, they did third arm of the study where they used tofacitinib plus dexamethasone. And then again, they reported that mortality was better. So out of the total 3 arms, although it was means not a well-defined RCT, a more of observational study, total of 44 patients died, 31% in tofacitinib group and 68.2% in dexamethasone group. So death in tofacitinib group was 10.2% versus 22.9% in dexamethasone group. So overall, after adjusting all odds, there was a 70% reduction in risk of dying in tofacitinib group as compared to dexa alone group. That's quite significant. And I think 2 or 3 more trials are ongoing for tofacitinib as well as baricitinib. So we'll have more well-developed and more RCTs on it. This is a meta-analysis of 4 randomized and 11 non-randomized trial. And 5 of these studies out of this are yet unpublished. They are still ongoing. So what it shows is addition of JAK inhibitor improves mortality. Addition of JAK inhibitor to the regimen decreases ICU admission, and it helps in early discharge. So quite promising. I think it would become standard of care in some time once we have a well-defined RCT. The second drug which has been tried in large populations is colchicine. It is generally used for treatment of gout. There are around 15-20 studies. I'm just presenting a meta-analysis. So this was a meta-analysis of 8 studies where 5,778 COVID-19 patients were included. So they showed improved mortality and decreased duration of hospital stay. So addition of colchicine can be considered because the kind of immune inflammation which is blocked by colchicine is little bit different as compared to what steroid and JAK inhibitors does. So what it does is it inhibits the inflammasomes, and it also blocks neutrophil aggregation, and it doesn't cause immunosuppression and steroid-induced hyperglycemia, those kind of side effects. And it's a relatively very safe and very cheap drug. So this can also be added to the regimen without any harm in those patients who are not improving with steroids or JAK inhibitors for stable ward patients. Other repurposed drug, TNF inhibitors, bevacizumab and itolizumab. They all have studies of around 20 to 25 patients each. And so this will take up if there are some questions. So at present, the ITSA guidelines says that steroids can be used in all moderate to severe patients, whether they are at home care or hospitalized or in ICU. Tocilizumab only in ward patients who are very sick or in ICU patients who are requiring organ support. So both the timing for tocilizumab is important. Otherwise, it does cause severe immunosuppression and can increase the risk of infections. Remdesivir, it recommends for mild to moderate to severe diseases. The neutralizing antibody complex, you can say, bamlanivimab, etevicimab, casirivimab, or imdemivir. This has recently been approved in India, and I think one Cipla is probably marketing it for some foreign country company. But this is only for home care patients in very early, only viral replicative phase disease. This is not for patients who are already in inflammatory phase. And I think in our country, the cost will be prohibitive, and less than 1% or even 0.1% of our population would be able to afford these monoclonal antibodies, but it has recently been approved. Baricitinib plus remdesivir combination has been approved after the data from ACT-2 trial. Baricitinib plus tofacitinib as standard of care in hospitalized or ICU patient is not yet approved. They are waiting for a RCT, but I think in this scenario, it can be considered in patients where we want to avoid steroids, or we are seeing that despite 48 hours of steroids, these patients are worsening. We from Rheumatology Association of Gujarat have come out with a guideline to how to use these immunomodulators. If needed, we can circulate it to everybody. Thank you. So we need a lot of help from all areas to win this virus.
Okay. Thank you, Pooja. Excellent talk. And I congratulate you for that. Very relevant and excellent and crisp. Here, I would like to add a few questions. Can we take the questions right now, or shall it? I think we should postpone it for after the second talk. Okay?
Yes,
so
madam.
Along with the panelists, we can take it, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
Here, my comments and my experience, I would like to share. Tocilizumab we have used in more than 200 patients in past 1.5 years. What matters is the right time. Otherwise, it's a double-edged sword. And as we know, the bacterial infection rate is quite high, around 15% in severely ill sick COVID patients. So steroids with Tosy together make a good background for sepsis, and we lose several of our patients once recovered from COVID due to sepsis. So the right time, that is day 6 onwards, with high IL-6, almost more than 5 times. And it works like wonders. It works like magic, and sometimes prevents intubation, sometimes treat patients on 15 liters of oxygen. But the timing should be the matter. Then we come to baricitinib and tofacitinib. And I have a question in the chat box. Are they comparable to tocilizumab? With the experience we have, they are not. But with remdesivir has an antiviral activity. So here I would like to clarify certain things which Pooja has done in her first slide very well. That initial 7 days are to have aggressive antiviral medication. Because at this time, if we use steroids, we are increasing the viral load. And if we increase the viral load, we are putting our lungs at a bigger risk of CRS with a more strong storm. So the role of initial 6 days, the role is of an antivirals, followed by all the medicines which Dr. Pooja has described, and baricitinib and tofacitinib both are helpful along with steroids and remdesivir, as shown by her in ACT-2 trial and the other large volume trial, and we should use them appropriately. So after summing up her talk, I would like to invite my second speaker, and I hope Dr. Gaurav has come out of all the technical glitches. Thank you, Pooja. And I think we can invite Dr. Gaurav now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pratibha. I'm now ready. Yeah. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Here some breakdown with the electricity shutdown, so I'm coming back. As already I listened some slides from rheumatologist doctor. Now I'm talking about a long-lasting, life-threatening sequelae as that is pulmonary fibrosis. And we already dealing with the most massive pandemic, and the time is very crucial and critical, where we are getting lots of patients. And my talk will be on the pulmonary fibrosis, that is the sequelae of COVID-19 pneumonia. And already we are dealing with the second wave of outbreak of COVID-19 infection in India from since last 3-4 weeks. And we are dealing with COVID-19 from since 12 to 15 months. And these are the old data. Already we have crossed active confirmed cases more than 2.5 crore. And new cases now, there is new cases presentation. Yesterday we got 3,22,000 cases. And confirmed deaths already crossed to 2,66,000. Yeah, as we already all know, 95% of patients have mild to moderate symptoms and they recovered. Among them, 95%, 14% patients have respiratory distress and hypoxemia, and these patients may develop some kind of respiratory pulmonary fibrosis. And rest of the 5% patient, among them, 30 to 50% patient, definitely they will develop pulmonary fibrosis. And this is the challenge. As there is increased number of infection, so this 30 to 50% patient amongst the 5% critical patient is a substantial number. So we have to, everybody is facing this problem. Yeah, and now this is a new term we are using. This is long haulers. Who they are? They are survived COVID-19 patient they continue to battle the symptom of illness long after they have been clinically tested negative for the disease. They are called as long haulers. And even in many studies, have reported that 70 to 80% of the patients who recovered from COVID-19, they present with persistence of symptoms, at least one or more symptoms, even after being declared COVID-free. And we are observing COVID-19 sequelae, which is vary from mild fatigue and body ache and headache to severe form, which require long-term oxygen therapy and lung transplantation due to the lung fibrosis, and significant cardiac abnormality and stroke, leading to significant impairment in quality of life. So this is causing big disability in a recovered patient. And if we see about the pulmonary fibrosis, this sequelae even cause more mortality in substantial proportion of recovered patient. And in early analysis from patient with COVID-19 who discharged from hospital, it has been seen that 33% of this recovered patient develop fibrotic abnormality. It varies from mild to moderate and severe pulmonary fibrosis. Sometimes patient is oxygen dependent, and as already I mentioned, there is a range of pulmonary fibrosis, and it has been seen that it can start within 3 weeks of the onset of symptom, regardless of the severity of acute illness. So the pulmonary fibrosis is observed within as early as 3 weeks. And it has been pathologically, in autopsy, it has been seen that as in ARDS, in COVID-19 pulmonary fibrosis, there is organizing diffuse alveolar damage, which is pathologically hallmark. And these are some risk factors which shared with IPF. So IPF and this post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis have same risk factors like male gender, advanced age, comorbid associated comorbid condition, and especially smoking and other thing. And in COVID patient, if patient need mechanical ventilation or long ICU stay, definitely he will develop more pulmonary fibrosis. Now, if we see just brief about the pathogenesis, as we all know, this COVID-19 virus attached with this AC inhibitor, ACE2 receptor, thus it cause down regulation of ACE2, which cause downstream activity of RS, which is important in maintaining, controlling the inflammation and pulmonary edema. Thus, it increases the inflammation and develop the pulmonary fibrosis. Just one thing I just want to point out is mechanism of pulmonary fibrosis in COVID-19 is different from IPF, as the site of injury in COVID-19 patient is alveolar epithelium, whereas not the in other disease it involved endothelial cells. These are some presentation of a radiological CT presentation of COVID-19 causing pulmonary fibrosis. Initially, there is ground glass opacities, but later on, if we are suspecting that patient may land up into pulmonary fibrosis, these are some manifestations, CT manifestation. One can find interstitial thickening, air bronchogram. There is consolidation, which reverse halo sign. Later on, it will convert into fibrosis, irregular interface, coarse reticular pattern, parenchymal bands, and sometimes pleural effusion. These are some case reports documenting this pulmonary fibrosis in different demography. You can see from 28 to 60 and with different comorbidity. And in those patients, they have given different drugs, even corticosteroid, this hydroxychloroquine, broad spectrum antibiotics, remdesivir, tocilizumab. Even they intervene with different drugs, with different demography, with different comorbidity. Even there is difference in each and everything, but these patients develop pulmonary fibrosis. and it documented as a reverse halo sign, tractional bronchiectasis, and sometime the honeycombing may be visible. This is some modified approach to diagnose the COVID-19 pulmonary fibrosis. Usually we do history taking, physical examination, and serology, CT scan, and PFT. But in what we do in COVID-19 fibrosis patient to diagnose, we defer this PFT because this is a generative procedure, and in we do each and everything with video consultation, video conferencing, even MDD, and we avoid this BAL and surgical lung biopsy because this invasive procedure is very risky and develop aerosol. So we defer this procedure also. This is the just modification, and these are the drugs which is used to treat the pulmonary fibrosis, as already talked about. Antiviral drug, first 7 days, the phase is viral phase, and our aim is to decrease the viral load. So antiviral drug, if we can decrease the viral load, definitely we can decrease the cytokine chance of cytokine storm and further pulmonary fibrosis. So different drugs like remdesivir and newer drugs, as already previous speaker mentioned, and some traditional medicines also used in China. And the most important steroid we use to decrease the inflammatory load in second half of the 14 days. And the most important, once fibrosis develop, these are the promising drugs. Still, few studies say still some randomized controlled trial is required to establish its role, when to start and when to stop this pirfenidone and nintedanib antifibrotic drug. But as IPF and this post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis share the common pathogenesis, pathophysiology, and common risk factors. So on the basis of that, we are using this pirfenidone and nintedanib, and they are showing good results. In some cases, we can use plasminogen activator, in especially where the ECMO is not available. I will tell you in the further slides. How now what is the mechanism of action of pirfenidone? Pirfenidone down regulate especially this transforming growth factor beta and IL-6. So further it stopped the transformation of fibroblast or activation of fibroblast and transformation of fibroblast into the myofibroblast, and decrease the deposition of extra cellular matrix and collagen. Same time, the most important, it reduced the LPS-induced acute lung injury and subsequent fibrosis. It is pirfenidone also act as antifibrotic, anti-inflammatory drug. It is a scavenger for reactive oxygen species, and it has other properties like it is anti-apoptotic and anti-fibrotic effect. So it act with this mechanism. Nintedanib is also is being used for reduce the fibrosis. This also slow the progression of pulmonary fibrotic disease regardless of pathological pattern by inhibiting the release of pro-inflammatory and pro-fibrotic mediators. Nintedanib is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, which is present in many growth factors, and thus it acts on reducing the fibrosis. One thing I just want to point out is nintedanib is associated with increased risk of bleeding, and we are already using anticoagulant in many COVID-19 patients. So it should be used once we have stopped this anticoagulant. If we want to add this nintedanib, or we should be cautious about bleeding risk. And both the drugs, pirfenidone as well as the nintedanib, both have hepatotoxic property. we usually use already COVID viral load virus. It is a virus disease causing hepatic derangement, and many times we are using antibiotics and other drugs which cause hepatotoxicity. So we should be very careful when we are using this pirfenidone and nintedanib. We know about the schedule, how to add first 7 days, 267 milligram, one capsule containing 260 milligram. Previous dose is used, and then we gradually increase the dose up to the 2403 milligram per day, and this is the optimal dose. Many times our Indian patient did not tolerate this large amount of drugs. So in my practice, I'm using nintedanib and patients are tolerating this. But definitely this pirfenidone is better drug than nintedanib. And we already talked about in previous lecture, steroid is rational to use because it reduces the host inflammatory response, cytokine storm, and thus prevent the lung injury and ARDS. In developing ARDS, there is no reliable evidence on efficacy of corticosteroid in treating pulmonary fibrosis following SARS-CoV infection. So we are using this steroid to prevent pulmonary fibrosis only empirically. There is no evidence. And even in recovery trial, if we use early phase of infection, like the first 7 days, it decreases the viral load clearance, as well as it causes increased risk to develop secondary infection. So steroid, if really required, then should be used in pulmonary fibrosis. And some other drug, I will not talk about spironolactone. Yes, this is very important drug. Tissue plasminogen activator. It should be used in only when there is a decreased PF threshold less than 50 and PCO2 less more than 60, and patient is not maintaining saturation even after proning and on mechanical ventilator, and there is no facility available for ECMO, then definitely we should think for TPA. But one thing I just want to point out is already this COVID-19 causing thrombocytopenia. So this is the limitation to use this drug. And these are the other drugs everybody knows about. These drugs, hydrochloroquine and all these chloroquine anti-malarial drug, they disrupt coronavirus cell receptor glycosylation, and thus in vitro they have shown efficient to stop SARS-CoV-2. Remdesivir, lopinavir, they decrease RNA replication due to higher affinity to viral enzyme. Thus, it stop the viral replication. And planning sometimes is very important. Yeah, favipiravir, it has been in vitro. They have shown very good results. So we are using in mild cases. If we start early, we can get more results. These are some strategy. I'm just giving brief. We should follow all the protocol to prevent the getting infection, social distancing, applying mask, and telecommunication, teleconsultation, and we should avoid unnecessary investigations or imaging or bronchoscopy and surgical. Thus, we can prevent this getting the infection, as well as virtual pulmonary rehabilitation program is very important for these kind of patients. Now, the take-home message is, considering huge number of individuals affected by COVID-19, even rare complication, but huge population is developing this pulmonary fibrosis. Elderly patients who require ICU care and mechanical ventilation are higher risk to develop lung fibrosis. Pirfenidone could
Madam, his connection is disconnected. You can carry on.
So I think in the interest of time, he has almost finished his presentation and was on his concluding slide. So I think there is. So I'll take it forward, and to summarize is the whole issue of pulmonary fibrosis. Look, out of 100, 15 people develop severe disease and need ICU care. Out of those 15% of people, almost whatever we can salvage, they go almost 50% out of them go into some form of pulmonary fibrosis, which is severe, which needs to be addressed. Rest of the patients who are healing at home, having some lung opacities, also have milder form of fibrosis, which recover naturally or with time. So sometimes we are prescribing inhaled steroids or inhalers based on PFTs and symptoms. So here our concern is pulmonary fibrosis, which is an issue beyond day-to-day problem. The people are on oxygen for 3 to 6 weeks. I have patients who are on oxygen for 3 months, longest. One of the patients, the fibrosis did not heal. So we put him on ECMO and we got a lung transplant done. So here the concern is about those critically ill patients, what things we can do, how we can help them. Options are limited. Some has already discussed in the form of steroids and immunomodulators. Others, antifibrotic agents, with all pulmonologists are using in ILD are pirfenidone and nintedanib, along with some repurposed drug like tissue plasminogen activators, which I have literally no experience, but with other agents, I can share my experience with the, all the faculty and our panelists. So here I would like to invite the MSN team for their presentation on their new molecules, and then we can go forward to the questions from the audience, and we can take our esteemed faculty to take the questions one by one. So over to the MSN team.
Thank you, madam. In the recent past, we could see like antiviral drugs like remdesivir, favipiravir vanish as demand rises on COVID surge, and at the same time, metro cities facing shortage of medicines for COVID amid surge in cases, and this has caused panic buying, case spike causing favipiravir shortage. So MSN addressing the shortage of COVID flu medicines by making it available across India, all the online retail pharmacies, Favilo, favipiravir tablets and Tofadose, tofacitinib tablets in 1 mg, Pharmacy, MedPlus, Nedmeds, Apollo Pharmacy, Medlife, Myra. And at the same time, support to COVID flu brands, Pulmofib, Perfenidone, and Dapifib, Dabigatron. And MSN future advanced molecules to battle against COVID. We are launching Baridose baricitinib tablet, selective Janus kinase inhibitor. US FDA issued an emergency use authorization, and we are coming with Molilo, molnupiravir tablets, rapid action within 24 hours, new antiviral drug, and complete suppression. And Avilo aviptadil injection, a synthetic vasoactive intestinal peptide. US FDA granted aviptadil for treatment of respiratory distress in COVID-19 patients. So together we fight against COVID-19, Favilo, favipiravir tablets, Tofadose, tofacitinib, and Pulmofib, Perfenidone, and Dapifib, Dabigatron. I request Madam Pratibha to take care of the question and answer sessions.
I appreciate and I welcome and I thank MSN for working at such a short time and trying to fill the gap between the demand and supply of essential medicines and repurposed medicine. I really appreciate it because 10 days back there was a deficiency of baricitinib because Eli Lilly original brand was not available in the market because of the use, because with the disproportionate use and supply chain. So I really appreciate and welcome their initiative. So it's time that I introduce our two panelists, and it is an excellent platform that we have people from Rajasthan, from Gujarat, from Mumbai, and from New Delhi sitting together and discussing a relevant topic. So I introduced Dr. Harish Chafle, who's a practicing pulmonologist from Mumbai. And Mumbai, we all know, had been suffering for months, weeks, with extensive number of cases of COVID. And I'm sure Dr. Chafle can, enrich our discussion with huge experience about the COVID and long COVID syndrome and pulmonary fibrosis. Dr. Chafle is practicing in Mumbai with lots of interest in intervention pulmonology and other aspects of pulmonology. So welcome, Dr. Chafle.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those kind words of introduction.
I'm pronouncing your surname correctly, sir.
Yeah. I think it's correct.
You correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
And now we have Dr. Ankit, our young rheumatologist from Rajkot. And Ankit with his MD medicine from
MGM Medical College.
Yeah, and then his fellowship in rheumatology from Mumbai, and he is practicing in Rajkot, and he's practicing in the most active branch, which is most sought after branch of rheumatology, with his special interest in ankylosing spondylitis and rheumatoid arthritis. And I'm hopeful that his experience with the extended spectrum of the rheumatology medicine would be of great help to all the people fighting against COVID. So not taking much of the time, I invite all the faculties for first we tackle the questions from the audience, and then we can, I can put some of my own concerns and discuss the relevant issue regarding COVID, long COVID and its complication, and CRS storm. So taking the, questions. I'm sorry. So we have the questions with me from the audience. So first question from the audience is, can we replace the scarcity of tocilizumab? We all are aware. So the question is very relevant, that is tocilizumab, baricitinib, tofacitinib, itolizumab, bevacizumab, how comparable they are? So I'll put it first to Pooja, first to Ankit, and then to Pooja.
Yeah, they are not comparable to each other, ma'am. Each one is having their own property and their own advantages and disadvantages. Bevacizumab and itolizumab, as well as tocilizumab, it works on a single molecule. It works on a single cytokine. If we are talking about the tofacitinib as well as the baricitinib, it works on multiple cytokines. I would like to, if asking me, I would like to go for a baricitinib rather than going for a tocilizumab for in the ICU setup, in the early stage of the ICU setup. At the same time, in current scenario, tocilizumab is very much unavailable in India.
So tocilizumab is more expensive than gold. It had been more expensive.
Anyway, yes.
Time more expensive than gold. So, and I'm totally against hoarding and black marketing. So as a doctor, we need to be rational. Here, I would like to take the call to Pooja. And Pooja has very categorically described that, yes, they are not comparable. We take the call, we take the, take from Ankit. Yes, in the early stages, maybe day 5, day 6, we can take help of baricitinib and tofa, and we can probably decrease the use of tocilizumab in later stages when patient in very serious CRS storm. About the toci, my view is to avoid the contraindication and rule out active infection any day. So Pooja, now how much is your experience with tocilizumab, and what point of time you like to start as you are involved with active COVID patients in DRDO? What is the point where you like to give tocilizumab? Do you start with tofa first and then add tocilizumab or itolizumab, or you depend upon single immunomodulator agent? Pooja.
Agree with you and with Dr. Ankit that yes, these drugs are not at all comparable, and in most cases we should not use two immunomodulators together. We are using them with steroid, but like combining tofacitinib or baricitinib with tocilizumab will also be too much. They would definitely increase the risk of infections. Tocilizumab is a drug which acts very fast in a matter of few hours to a single day. So in patients who are very sick, who are like requiring intubation or ventilator support, BiPAP support, in those patients who, and probably within 10 to 14 days of illness, after 14 days, some amount of fibrosis starts setting in. So it's not like tocilizumab should be used once the tofa or bari has failed. It depends on the individual patient. If patient is very sick, is requiring organ support, is having extensive cytokine storm, there probably the first drug to be used will be tocilizumab along with low-dose steroid. Baricitinib and tofacitinib, they are oral molecules. They take time to act. Baricitinib maybe around 36 to 48 hours, and tofacitinib will take little bit more, maybe 3 to 5 days. So for these drugs, we should choose patients who are hemodynamically stable, who are developing hypoxemia and have not responded well to 6 milligram dexamethasone over 48 hours. They are still having rising CRP. They are still having altered D-dimer. We are observing that the oxygen requirement are rising. So for those patients, we should reserve tofa. So clear way we say that ward patients who are stable, tofa berry can be tried once dexa is not helping that much or disease is progressing. For ICU patients, ICU generally it's difficult to get these times. So there also once, like if patient is not being settled with support care, then add to TOSI.
Okay, I'll summarize it once we talk Dr. Chafle's opinion. He's a pulmonologist. Sir, in your experience, where you use TOSI and where you use baricitinib or tofacitinib? Dr. Harish.
Yeah, so actually, yeah. So as rightly said by Pooja, the drug to be used when you feel that the cytokine storm is at its maximum peak, when the patient is very sick in ICU, I don't think other agents will take care of the storm as well as TOSI can do. I have my very good experience of tocilizumab in the initial part of pandemic also, when it was very scarcely available, and to the second wave now. And it's a wonder drug. It's a magic drug. Whatever the trials has said, the personal experience is totally different from the trial experience. If you use appropriately in judicious patients, and the timing, as she rightly said, 2 doses also I have used in certain patients 12 hours apart, and it has done magic. So all those patients who have high inflammatory markers, high IL-6 CRP values, and in whom the CT severity score was say more than 14, there is no cutoff for that basically. But you know the CT severity score is high, CRP is high, IL-6 is high, and the oxygen requirement is increasing. Like some patient comes to you with 6 liter nasal oxygen and suddenly deteriorates, and you know that the storm is going very fast. And if you cannot give TOSI on time, I think this patient cannot be saved. So definitely. Whereas other drugs, as we have discussed, they are in oral form, and as they take time to take its effect in the body, it will take time to take its effect in the cytokine storm as well. So in acutely ill ICU patients, definitely it is tocilizumab, but no other agent as far as I am concerned.
Okay. No, we have 3 panelists who are talking in the same tune. That if the patient is on 8 to 12 liters of oxygen, his IL-6 is very high, he has no absolute contraindication. We are scared that anytime he can go on, ventilator, NIV, HFNC, or the heart is going to 80 to 100%. And I would agree with Dr. Chafle absolutely that in certain patients, tocilizumab act like a wonder drug. I have used even 4 doses in few of my patients, where we were absolutely sure of absence of infection, and it has made a difference between life and death, and we could save them from going to the ventilator. So those patients I can count on the tip of my fingers. Now we take the take-home message here for the audiences that if patient is between 30% to 50% of oxygen demand, we can start early with oral agents, which might take longer to act. So if the patient is on 3 liters, on 4 liters, and we are scared that with time, 1, 2, 3 days onward, he's not improving, we should immediately start on baricitinib and tofacitinib. And if despite of 2 or 3 days of oral agents, the patient is still deteriorating, we should take a call on ruling out active infection for tocilizumab. If the patient is moving from 30%, 40% to 50, 60, 70, 80% of oxygen demand, tocilizumab should be used as early as possible without giving a chance to deteriorate to 100% oxygen level. But since it is expensive and less available, at times you are not able to do so. Here, I would like to invite Dr. Gaurav for his experience on a combination of tofacitinib and baricitinib with remdesivir. Dr. Gaurav, how do you use it and how you find it, how effective you find it?
Yeah, I have not much this experience about the combination with remdesivir, these two drugs, but definitely I have used in 2 or 3 patients only, and they shown better result as compared to singly when I used with remdesivir only.
So, but as per the ACT-2 trial, I think remdesivir we use in the viral replication phase. And if we can rule out active infection, tofacitinib should be started simultaneously if the oxygen demand is 3 to 4 liters. That would be my take on this platform, on this national platform. And it will help prevent several patients from deterioration or going on NIV, HFNC or ventilator. So start using it day 5, day 4, day 5, day 6.
It should be
oxygen demand is
early. And definitely, in my view, few patients showing decreased mortality. Definitely, it is my experience only. I don't know whether really many trials are needed to establish this thing.
So actually, problem with these era is this is the time the trials cannot be RCTs. You cannot deprive certain patients of, even if the benefit is of minuscule. So they are all observational studies. Very difficult to have head-to-head trials, right? Even if certain, like the Covecta trial doesn't speak highly of Tosi, but my own experience with Tosi is amazing if the patient selection is appropriate. So I would agree with Dr. Harish Shafle. Now here we have talked about the immunomodulators, and we have taken a call that use early if the oxygen demand is between 25 to 50% will be the oral agents. If the patient is still deteriorating, we would like to go to Tosi after ruling out active infection. So here I stop at the immunomodulator discussion and move on to the pulmonary fibrosis discussion, which I would actively putting the questions to our pulmonologist here now, right? So now the question which our viewers has asked is the preference between pirfenidone and nintedanib, and what is your choice? How do you select? Any special consideration between the 2 molecules? So I'll put it from to Dr. Chhabra because he's already there, and then Harish, you can give your opinion regarding that.
Yeah, this is very good question. Definitely, 2 drugs we have to treat the pulmonary fibrosis. Pirfenidone versus nintedanib. Many doctors have debate about that. Nintedanib, I usually prefer pirfenidone because this is better drug than nintedanib. Only the problem is pirfenidone is never, we cannot, patient never tolerate the optimal dose of pirfenidone. So when patient is not able to tolerate, and then I definitely switch to nintedanib. But one thing we have to remember about nintedanib is that it can cause increased tendency for bleeding if we are using with anticoagulants. So definitely my choice will be the pirfenidone, but in adequate dose.
Dr. Harish, what is your take on that?
Yeah, so as rightly said by Gaurav, the same is with me actually. Usually I prefer pirfenidone, and I have seen that if you start early, say you know that the patient's oxygen requirement is high, and his CT severity score is high. And the current experience in second wave is the fibrosis is setting in early. So within 21 days, I have patients who have proven to be COVID negative, and still the oxygen requirement is more than 60% or more than 70% for that matter. So if you start pirfenidone early to these patients, only problem with pirfenidone I see is the tolerance. At times, patients who have GI intolerance, who have loose motions and gastric bloating, those are the patients I think should be chosen nintedanib ahead of pirfenidone, just to make sure that the tolerance is proper. Otherwise, nintedanib, so those patients who have problems with pirfenidone in the terms of raised SGOT-PT levels, and those patients who cannot tolerate the drug, I think nintedanib is another choice possible. Because all patients of COVID-related fibrosis and who battle with COVID for a long time, they are already on some anticoagulant in the oral apixaban or enoxaparin. And as we all know, there is a risk of bleeding and other things. There's an interaction with the oral anticoagulant or directly acting oral anticoagulant with nintedanib. That's why many people are preferring pirfenidone, and is same with me. And as we use more and more certain drugs, the confidence level increases, and that is how I think you tend to choose one from another.
Right. I agree with Dr. Harish, this thing that since we have more experience with pirfenidone, we feel more sure. We are more sure of the side effect profile of pirfenidone, except the tolerance issue. So the take-home message is we can choose any. Pirfenidone is preferred because in Indian population we have larger experience. Nintedanib can be chosen in selective patients as patients are intolerant to pirfenidone. Is it? So that's the take-home message. Now I put my next question starting from Ankit. I hope he's also taking care of the COVID patients in Rajkot. So how do you manage anticoagulants in COVID patients? Any specific guidelines you're following? What are the agents you like to use, Ankit, in admitted patient and in home care?
In home care, ma'am, I straight away start the patient on, if I see the D dimer is rising up, or if I see the infection is rising up, then I straight away start the patient on.
What are your cutoff values of D dimer, Ankit?
D dimer more than 0.5, I straight away start them on aspirin. And if the patient is an ICU setup or is in ward setup, mostly we send away. If the patient is hospitalized, mostly they are in the ICU. In that case, we usually put them on low molecular weight heparin. And at the time of discharge, we either shift them back on the aspirin or on the rivaroxaban.
Okay. So that is the take. With what are you doing, Dr. Pooja, in DRDO Ahmedabad? So what are you doing?
So we start anticoagulation only.
Okay, I think there is some network issues. So I'll take this question to Dr. Harish.
Yeah. So actually, definitely a very good discussion happening here. And I would like to add on that use of anticoagulation is very, very important, because in COVID, as we all know, there is something beyond the coagulation that we can think of. There is platelet hypersensitivity. That's why antiplatelets definitely have a role. And when choosing antiplatelet in combination with the directly acting oral anticoagulants or enoxaparin, I usually prefer clopidogrel or aspirin, just because the risk of GI bleed and other side effects is less with clopidogrel rather than aspirin. And the cutoff of D dimer is definitely 0.5 and above. But you need to know that this patient has risk factors for DVT and other things are not that you need to think before using. And even I have gone to using heparin infusion in ICU, in my ICU patients, wherein the D dimer was more than 10,000 value, and it was like you are just facing a birth of thrombotic episodes in the severely ill patients in the ICU. So we usually start heparin infusion for this patient with monitored APTT 6 hourly. And with this also, I have had certain problems of HIT developing heparin-induced thrombocytopenia in certain patients where other agents were used. But definitely using proper anticoagulants.
Here I would like to ask you, Dr. Harish, is the infusion is only for 24 hours? How long you continue it? Heparin infusion in if the D dimer is more than...
No, till the time that you see that the D dimer value is coming down.
Okay. because
So
most of the
infusion
time
is for, it is not 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah, and you are unable to do a CT pulmonary angio to prove the point of embolism.
Yes.
It is simply a clinical decision in such sick patients.
So I have gone to that level also, that I have done a 2D echo on a patient and demonstrated the signs of pulmonary embolism on 2D echo with high D-dimer value and rising FiO2 requirement to the patient. I have thrombolized these patients, and few patients have definitely done well with thrombolysis with altiplase, 100 milligrams or 1 hour I have given, followed by heparin infusion, and they have done well. So definitely, but there is no cutoff that heparin infusion should be given for 24 or 48 hours. You need to monitor your D-dimer values and see the clinical improvement in the patient, and that is how you have to take it further.
So we here have a very special case, which are very rare, very less percentage of patients who need this kind of intervention. Most of the patients, I think, do well on low molecular weight heparin, oral anticoagulant. Yeah. So in admitted patient, we are in my hospital, we have a protocol. Anybody who's admitted and has more than normal D-dimer, we start on low molecular weight heparin. Number one. Number two, when we discharge patients, usually we are not discharging them on anticoagulants unless and until they are more than 60 years of age, even with normal D-dimer. If they are more than 60 years with having comorbidities and more prone to pulmonary embolism, like previous cancers, previous episodes, obesity, immobility, pulmonary fibrosis, not moving actively, we give them 3 to 6 weeks of oral anticoagulants. So we have here is a question which I would like to put to my fellow colleagues, fellow faculty members. What is their take on patients who are discharged from ICUs, how long they prescribe oral anticoagulants, which agent they prefer, and can we replace one agent with other? So starting from Pooja, if you are connected, then we can move to Dr. Harish and Ankit and Dr. Chhabra. Pooja, are you connected?
For ICU patients, maybe it varies from 1 to 3 months, can be given up to 3 months in patients with severe comorbidities, but at least 1 month is required.
Okay. I think here I would like 3 to 6 weeks is the point. If they become mobilized at 3 weeks, we can stop because they do have their own side effects. But if they are still immobilized on oxygen, we can continue for 6 weeks after discharge, right?
For ward patients, we're giving for 3 weeks. Ward patients, 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Understood.
And now here I would like that there is a question from audience that can we replace one agent over the other? Is there any agent which is better over the other? Here I would like to take opinion from all our 4 panelists. They just give one NOAC which they preferably used. So Dr. Harish, your NOAC of choice.
Yeah. So now NOAC has become a DOAC now. Actually, it's no more called a NOAC.
Yeah.
But my preference is basically apixaban because actually there is no head-to-head trial and comparison between dabigatran, apixaban, and rivaroxaban. But whatever you are using daily, as I said earlier also, it becomes your habit to keep on using because you develop more confidence and other things. So 5 mg twice a day or 2.5 mg twice a day, appropriate dosing with the creatinine and other factors taking into consideration the age of the patient. And definitely post ICU discharge 3 weeks, definitely I give. And I continue to 6 weeks, as you rightly said, if the patient still requires oxygen requirement at home.
Dr. Chhabra. Okay, I think he has lost. Ankit.
If the patient is if I have treated the patient in the OPD or if in the ward, I usually go on for 3 to 4 weeks, usually with the aspirin. But yes, if the
Even
patient
if you have normal D-dimers?
No normal D. The cutoff is the cutoff.
So I here want to emphasize one thing. People who are treated at home or in OPD and with normal D-dimers, please don't use blood thinners if they are younger than 65 years of age. Only use blood thinners in younger patients if they have previous episodes of embolism. If they are a cancer patient suffering from cancer, if they are bedridden due to any reason. So please, for all the doctors who are our viewers, so with the permission of the expert panel here, please don't use them unnecessarily because they have their side effects. Okay. So Ankit, you agree with me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Usually the cutoff is more than 0.5 or 0.5 or more than that.
Right.
But otherwise, if any of the comorbidities is existing, then we should be using. Then I use the anticoagulant. Usually for ward or OPD patients, I go on for 3 to 4 weeks. But otherwise, with aspirin. But yes, if patient is discharged from ICU, then I go on with the rivaroxaban for at least for 6 to 8 weeks.
Pooja, your agent of choice?
I'm using either one. For younger patients, Ecosprin. Younger patients, more than 45 to 60 who have D-dimers above 1000 at discharge, Ecosprin. For those with comorbidities discharged from ICU, either rivaroxaban or apixaban for 3 to 6 weeks.
Okay.
For totally bed-bound patients, up to 3 months.
So here, okay, we have the Dr. Chhabra is unable to connect, I think, but we have a relevant discussion here, and I would like to conclude our discussion here about the anticoagulants. We have already talked about all the 2 aspects. This is the 3rd aspect we are discussing on this platform. That I would like to conclude that none of the agents is superior over the other. Number 1. So we can use apixaban, rivaroxaban, or dabigatran, whatever is available in preventive or therapeutic doses, depending upon patient profile. If it is there is no proven PE, please use preventive doses. If there is proven PE, we have to use for 3 to 6 months in therapeutic doses. We can choose any over the other. There is no advantage except the creatinine part which Dr. Harish said about apixaban. So any agent can be used. Ecosprin per se and clopidogrel per se, no support, but yes, they give us some blood thinning, and we can be easily used in OPD patients or less sick patients just for our own satisfaction and their satisfaction. Because these days people are reading lots of media and lots of things about the clots. So here I would
I would like to add that platelet hypersensitivity is a very important phenomena in prothrombotic state in COVID-19 patient. That's why single antiplatelet for 1 month, either ecosprin or clopidogrel, should be added in appropriate patients.
Okay, we are go with by your experience, Dr. Harish. I think this is the time we wind up the meeting. If there is permission from the organizers from MSN.
Madam, we'll take only 1 minute, madam. We'll just So looking forward for exclusive patronage on world-class international quality brands, Fevilo, Favipiravir tablets, Tufados, Tufacitinib tablets, and Pulmofib, Perfenidone tablets. We may be the young player, but our drive and enthusiasm are best in associating with you. And we thank each and all the master faculties and all the participants for joining this webinar. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, MSN, for giving us the opportunity. And it's a pleasure to connect with Dr. Harish, Ankit, Pooja, and Dr. Chhabra. Hope we will meet in better times where we can shake hands and share some warm hugs with each other. So,
yeah, and share the experience.
Yeah, share the experience.
Got it.
Okay, see you in person sometime.
Sure, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Thank you, Pooja.
Bye-bye.